What would you do if the only thing left to your name was $11, a busted trunk, and a piece of land nobody else on earth wanted? 19 years old, thrown out of the only home she'd ever known, with the door shut behind her before the sun had even finished rising. That was where this story begins. Her uncle, Ezra Doyle, had raised her out of duty rather than love. And when she refused to marry the man he'd chosen to settle his debts, he told her she was no longer welcome under his roof. She left with a carpet bag, a small purse of coins, and nothing else. Wandering into the town of Copper Bend, Colorado, in the autumn of 1899, she heard folks laughing about an old, rotted freight wagon that had hung off the edge of Widow's Grade for 70 years, wedged in the rock where it had crashed generations before. The land agent sold her the salvage rights for $4, certain he was cheating a foolish, desperate girl. Nobody imagined that Wagon still held something sealed away, something that would not only change her life, but quietly set an entire town back on its feet, and settle a debt 70 years overdue. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Iris Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, and if stories like this one speak to something in you, consider following or subscribing to our channel, so you never miss the next one. Iris Calloway had been born in a cabin at the edge of the Arkansas River, in a spring so wet that her mother used to say she'd come into the world already knowing how to survive a flood. Her father, a wheelwright by trade, had died of a fever when she was 7, leaving behind little but a set of tools, a stubborn wife, and a daughter who watched him work with the kind of attention most children reserved for church. Her mother followed him 3 winters later, worn thin by grief and labor, and Iris was sent to live with her mother's brother, Ezra Doyle, a hard, calculating man who ran a modest freight forwarding office in the town of Larrabee. He was not cruel in the way of raised fists, but he was cruel in the way of a closed ledger. Every kindness he offered was tallied. Every meal she ate was a debt she was expected to repay in labor, obedience, or eventually, marriage to whoever might settle his own accounts. Still, in that house, Iris learned things that would matter more than she could have guessed. She learned to read a wagon's construction the way other girls learned embroidery. The joints, the axles, the strain points where wood would fail under a heavy enough load, because her uncle kept her cataloging salvaged freight parts in the yard behind his office, and because some stubborn piece of her father lived on in her hands. She learned to read ledgers, too, spending long evenings copying numbers into columns by lamplight, learning the particular silence of a page that had been altered, the way ink sat differently when a figure had been changed after the fact. She learned patience from her aunt, a quiet woman who mended harnesses and never once raised her voice, who told her that the world often threw away what it hadn't taken the time to understand, and that a discerning eye was worth more than a full purse. And she learned, above all, a fierce and private code, instilled by her father before he died, that a person's name and a person's word were the only inheritance worth protecting. Because unlike money, they could not be spent, only kept or squandered. She did not know, as a girl sorting bent nails and cracked axles in her uncle's yard, that these lessons were being stored inside her, like kindling, waiting for the spark that would prove them worth everything. By the time Iris turned 19, her uncle's freight business had fallen on hard times, undercut by the railroads creeping ever closer to Larrabee. And Ezra Doyle grew desperate in the particular way that men grow desperate when they have built their pride on being needed. He found, in a merchant named Corwin Bell, both a source of new capital and a solution to what he considered his last unprofitable asset, his niece. Corwin was twice her age, sour-tempered, and wealthy enough that Ezra saw the arrangement as a tidy settling of accounts, a debt paid in flesh rather than coin. When Iris refused, quietly but without wavering, her uncle's fury was not loud, but it was final. He told her that a girl who would not contribute to the household that had fed and sheltered her for 12 years had no further claim upon it, and he gave her until sundown to be gone. She did not beg. She packed her father's smallest set of tools, wrapped in an old shirt, along with what coins she had saved from years of small mendings and mercantile errands run for neighbors, and she walked out of Larrabee with a resolve that surprised even her. She traveled west by wagon and on foot, taking work where she could, mending harness leather in one town, keeping books for a feed store in another, until, 3 weeks later, footsore and nearly out of funds, she arrived in the mining town of Copper Bend, nestled in the Colorado high country beneath a ridge locals called Widow's Grade. It was there, in the land office, listening to 2 clerks laugh about a worthless piece of salvage rights nobody would ever claim, that she first heard mention of the wagon that had hung off the cliff edge for 70 years. And something in her, some old, quiet instinct her father had planted, told her to listen closer. The clerks told her the story the way men tell stories they've long since stopped believing were true. That back in 1829, a freight driver named Thomas Vane had been running a payroll shipment up the old mountain road to the Ashford silver mine, carrying the miners' wages during a season when the mine was already teetering on collapse. When a sudden storm, or bandits, depending on who told it, sent his wagon over the edge of the grade. The wagon had wedged itself in a crook of rock some 40 feet down the cliff face, too dangerous and too worthless to retrieve, and Thomas Vane himself was never found, alive or dead. The mine's owner at the time, a man named Silas Grantham, had declared publicly that Vane had stolen the payroll and staged the crash to cover his escape, and the accusation stuck so thoroughly that Vane's widow and young son were driven from Copper Bend within the year, their names spoken afterward only with contempt. The mine, deprived of its payroll, limped along another decade before finally closing, and Copper Bend had never fully recovered its old prosperity. The wagon, meanwhile, simply stayed where it had fallen, rusting and rotting in full view of the road above, a landmark and a cautionary tale, until the county, tired of fielding questions about who owned the wreck, put its salvage rights up for sale to anyone foolish enough to want them. Iris paid $4 for a signed paper granting her whatever lay in or upon that wagon, and the land agent, counting her coins with poorly hidden amusement, told her she'd just bought the most useless deed in the territory. She only nodded, tucked the paper into her bag, and asked him where the trailhead down to the grade began. The climb down to the wagon took her the better part of a morning, and more than once she wondered whether the land agent's laughter had been justified. Widow's Grade earned its name honestly, a narrow shelf of rock jutting from the mountainside, with a drop below it steep enough to make her stomach turn, and the wagon itself, when she finally reached it, looked less like a vehicle and more like the fossilized ribcage of some enormous animal, its wooden frame silvered by 70 years of sun and frost. One wheel long gone, the canvas cover rotted into lace-thin shreds that fluttered faintly in the wind. She spent nearly an hour simply working out how to approach it safely, wedging herself onto a shelf of stone beside the wreck and testing the old timbers with careful hands before trusting her weight to them. Most of what she found inside was exactly what 70 years of exposure would produce. A ruin of rotted crates, rusted tools fused solid with corrosion, the brittle remains of what had once been sacks of grain long since consumed by mice and moisture and time. But her father's training had taught her to look past the ruin to the structure beneath it, and something about the wagon's underframe struck her as wrong the moment her hand found it. A section beneath the driver's seat that was thicker than it should have been, boxed in with a second layer of wood that did not match the weathering of the rest of the vehicle, as though it had been added deliberately, and hidden, It took her the better part of another hour, working with a small chisel from her father's tool roll, to pry the false panel loose, and when she did, her breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the height beneath her. Tucked into the hollow space was an iron strongbox, small enough to carry under one arm, its surface rusted, but its seams still tightly sealed, and beside it, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now a fragile, brittle shell, a bundle of papers that had somehow, against 70 years of mountain weather, survived. She did not open the strongbox there, 40 feet above a drop that could kill her in an instant of clumsiness. Instead, she secured it, and the papers as best she could inside her bag made the long, careful climb back up to the road, and did not breathe easily until her boots were once again on solid, level ground. It was only that evening, in the small rented room above Copper Bend's Mercantile that she'd taken with nearly the last of her money, that she allowed herself to examine what she had found. The strongbox, when she finally worked its rusted latch open with a hairpin and a great deal of patience, held not gold, as she had half expected, but something she came to understand was worth a great deal more to the people of Copper Bend, a leather-bound ledger, its pages foxed but legible, recording in careful, familiar handwriting the movements of freight and payroll for the Ashford silver mine across the better part of 2 years. The oilcloth bundle held letters, a dozen or more, written in a different hand entirely, urgent and increasingly desperate in tone, addressed to a name she did not yet recognize, Thomas, and signed only with the initial M. She read long into the night by candlelight, piecing together fragments, and slowly, the shape of what had truly happened 70 years ago began to surface, like a stone rising out of a receding flood. The ledger, she came to understand, was Thomas Vane's own record of his freight runs, meticulous in the way her father had taught her a working man's books ought to be. And it documented something the official story of 1829 had conveniently omitted: that in the months before his final run, the payroll shipments to the Ashford mine had been consistently, deliberately shorted, with the difference recorded in a separate column in a hand Iris did not recognize at first, until she compared it against a faded signature on one of the letters, and realized it belonged to Silas Grantham himself, the mine's owner and the very man who had accused Vane of theft. The letters from M, who she would later learn was Vane's own wife, Margaret, spoke of Thomas's growing fear that he had uncovered evidence of Grantham skimming the miner's wages for himself, funneling the shortfall into private accounts, even as he publicly lamented the mine's failing fortunes, and of Thomas's plan to carry both the ledger and copies of the letters to the territorial marshal in the next town, using his final payroll run as cover, so as not to alert Grantham to what he knew. The wreck of the wagon, then, had not been the act of a thief fleeing with stolen wages, but very likely the desperate final act of an honest man trying to protect the truth, hiding the evidence in the one place he could reach as the wagon went over the edge, perhaps already injured, perhaps already resigned to the fact that he would not survive the fall, choosing in his last moments to save the proof rather than himself. Iris sat with that understanding for a long while that night, the candle burning low, and felt something settle inside her that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but a fierce, quiet clarity, the same clarity her father used to describe when he found the flaw in a wheel that everyone else had insisted was sound. She understood, with a certainty that frightened her a little, that she was now the only living person who knew the truth of what had happened to Thomas Vane, and that the discovery in her hands was not treasure in any way the world commonly measured it, but it was, perhaps, worth a great deal more. The following days, Iris moved carefully, mindful that Copper Bend was a small town with long memories, and that the name Grantham was not, as she quickly learned, a relic of the past at all. Silas Grantham's grandson, Aldous Grantham, now sat as the town's mayor and chief landholder. Having built the family's continued prosperity on investments made, she now suspected, from that very same skimmed payroll money 70 years before. When she began, gently and without revealing all she knew, to ask questions at the general store and the church social about the old Vane family, whether any descendants remained, what had become of Margaret and the boy, she found the townspeople's memories oddly rehearsed. The story of the thieving freight driver repeated in the same flat, unquestioning tone in every household, as though it had long ago hardened into something too settled to examine. It was the elderly seamstress, Odessa Frey, who finally told her, in a lowered voice over a cup of chicory coffee, that Margaret Vane had died within 2 years of the scandal, broken by shame and poverty. But that her son, young at the time, had been taken in by distant relatives, and had, decades later, returned to the region under his mother's maiden name, Wren, to avoid the stain still attached to his father's memory. Odessa believed he now ran a modest blacksmith shop in the neighboring town of Hollis Creek, a man in his 60s named Walter Wren, who to this day, she said, would not speak of his father at all. Iris rode to Hollis Creek within the week, carrying the ledger and letters wrapped carefully in cloth, and found Walter Wren exactly where Odessa had said, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired man with his father's same steady, careful hands. And when she laid the ledger before him and explained what she had found sealed inside the wagon on Widow's Grade, she watched 70 years of quiet, unspoken shame drain slowly from a stranger's face, replaced by something that looked almost too fragile to be called hope. Walter Wren's tears, when they came, were not loud, but Iris understood in that moment that she had stumbled into something far larger than a personal discovery. She had stumbled into the unfinished business of an entire family, and by extension, an entire town whose fortunes had been quietly poisoned at the root by a lie told 70 years before. But understanding this also meant understanding the danger of what she now carried. If Aldous Grantham's family wealth had indeed been built on his grandfather's theft, then the ledger in her possession was not merely a vindication of a dead man's name. It was a threat to the mayor's own standing, his properties, quite possibly his freedom, should the territorial authorities take an interest in a 70-year-old embezzlement once proof surfaced. Walter Wren, cautious after a lifetime of hiding, urged her to consider carefully before taking the matter public, warning her that Aldous Grantham was not a man who lost gracefully, and that Copper Bend, small as it was, still largely depended on Grantham land and Grantham goodwill for its continued survival. Iris spent several sleepless nights turning the problem over, weighing her father's old conviction that a name and a word were worth protecting against the very real fear of what a powerful, cornered man might do to protect his own. In the end, it was not ambition or even anger that decided her, but a simpler thought that kept returning to her in the dark, that Thomas Vane had died, quite possibly, trying to protect the truth for people who would never even know his name, and that letting that sacrifice remain buried felt, to her, like a second theft entirely, one she was no longer willing to be party to, however quietly. Word travels quickly in a small mining town, and it did not take long for Aldous Grantham to learn that a young stranger had been asking questions about the old Vane wreck, visiting Walter Wren in Hollis Creek, and carrying papers she would show to no one. He called on her himself, at the boarding house where she stayed, dressed in the fine dark wool of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and his manner, though outwardly courteous, carried an unmistakable edge of warning beneath it. He told her that Copper Bend had put the unfortunate business of the Vane wagon behind it decades ago, that stirring up old scandal would serve no purpose but to unsettle a community already struggling, to keep its remaining mine operations solvent, and that he would consider it a personal kindness if she left whatever she had found where it belonged, in the past. When Iris, with careful and deliberate calm, informed him that she possessed his grandfather's own ledger, in his grandfather's own hand, documenting the systematic theft of miners' wages, Grantham's courtesy did not so much crack as simply evaporate, replaced by a coldness that made the room feel considerably smaller. He offered her money. First, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to the girl who had arrived in Copper Bend with $11 to her name, and when she declined, his tone shifted toward threat, reminding her that she was a friendless stranger with no standing in this town, no family to protect her, and that accusations against a man of his position had a way of rebounding badly upon those who made them. Iris, who had spent her whole life being told by men like her uncle exactly how little standing she had, found that his threats, rather than frightening her into silence, only clarified her resolve. And she told him, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, that she intended to bring the ledger before the town council at the next public meeting, and that he was welcome to attend and explain his grandfather's handwriting however he saw fit. In the days before the council meeting, Grantham did not sit idle. He spread word among his tenants and business associates that the newcomer was a confidence artist attempting to extort him with forged documents, and several of the town's more prominent citizens, beholden to Grantham for loans or leases, made a point of avoiding Iris on the street, or worse, speaking against her openly. She felt, in those days, the particular loneliness of standing against a name that had shaped a town's habits of thought for 2 generations, and there were nights she lay awake wondering whether her father's old conviction about truth and reputation was, after all, a comfort meant for easier times than her own. But she was not entirely without allies. Walter Wren, despite decades of hiding, made the journey to Copper Bend himself to stand beside her, bringing with him letters his mother had kept until her death, letters that corroborated the story from another angle entirely. Odessa Fry, whose memory of the old scandal had never quite settled into comfortable certainty, began quietly reminding her neighbors of details that had never fit the official story. How quickly the Grantham family fortunes had grown just as the mines had faltered. How Margaret Vane had always insisted, to the end of her short life, that her husband was no thief, and the town's aging blacksmith, a man who had apprenticed under old Silas Grantham himself as a boy, came forward with a memory he said he'd carried uneasily for 50 years, of overhearing Silas instruct a clerk, the very week before the wagon went over the edge, to handle the matter of Vane before the driver reached the marshal in the next county. Piece by piece, the town's long-settled story began, quietly, to come loose at its seams, and Iris understood that she was no longer merely the custodian of an old ledger, but the thread that a whole community's buried memory had been waiting, perhaps for 70 years, to pull. The night of the council meeting, the schoolhouse that served as Copper Bend's public hall was fuller than anyone could remember it being in years. Farmers and miners and merchants crowded onto benches meant for children, lanterns casting a restless, flickering light across faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Iris stood at the front of that room with the ledger open before her, Walter Wren seated in the front row with his mother's letters in his lap, and Aldous Grantham near the back, arms folded, his expression carved into careful, contemptuous patience. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, laying out first the discovery of the wagon's hidden panel, then the ledger's careful record of shorted payrolls, then the letters describing Thomas Vane's fear and his final, fatal plan to expose what he'd found. She did not raise her voice, did not appeal to anger, but let the documents speak for themselves, passing pages hand to hand through the room so that skeptical eyes could examine the handwriting themselves, could compare Silas Grantham's signature on the ledger against his signature on decades-old land deeds that the county recorder, present at Iris's quiet request, had brought along for exactly that comparison. When Aldous Grantham rose to denounce the whole affair as forgery and extortion, it was the old blacksmith who cut through the room's uncertain murmur with his account of the overheard order 50 years before, his voice trembling but clear, and it was that testimony, more than any document, that seemed finally to tip the room's collective memory from doubt into recognition, as though the town had been waiting all along for permission to believe what some deep, unspoken part of it had always suspected. What followed was not the swift, dramatic justice of a courtroom, but the slower, more fitting justice of a community deciding, together, to stop protecting a lie. The county authorities, once alerted, opened an inquiry into the Grantham family's historical land acquisitions. And while 70 years had placed the original theft itself beyond the reach of criminal prosecution, the inquiry uncovered enough irregularity in more recent Grantham dealings. Leases quietly manipulated, mining claims recorded under questionable circumstances, that Aldous Grantham found himself, within the year, stripped of his position as mayor and facing lawsuits from tenants who had long suspected but never dared challenge the terms of their arrangements with him. It was not ruin exactly, but it was a quiet, thorough unraveling of the untouchable authority his family name had carried for 2 generations. And there was a particular, sober satisfaction in watching a man who had built his power on other people's silence finally undone by the return of their voice. More important to Iris than Grantham's downfall, though, was what the ledger's proof made possible for the town itself. The Ashford Mine's original claim, it turned out, had never been legally transferred out of the ownership structure established before the scandal. Tangled for decades in the same fraudulent paperwork that had buried Thomas Vane's name, and with the truth now established, Walter Wren, as the last direct descendant, held rightful claim to reopen it under fair and updated terms. He chose, in a decision that moved Iris more than she expected, to do so as a cooperative venture, offering shares of the mine's future proceeds to the very miners' families whose grandfathers had been shorted 70 years before. And he asked Iris, whose sharp eye for structure and honest ledgers had uncovered the whole truth, to help him set the operation on fair and transparent footing from its very first day. Copper Bend, in the 2 years that followed, became a different town than the one Iris had wandered into with $11 and a foolish deed to a worthless wreck. The reopened mine, honestly run, brought new wages into households that had gone thin for a generation, and some portion of its early proceeds, at Walter Wren's insistence and Iris's careful accounting, went toward rebuilding the town's neglected schoolhouse and establishing a small fund for families who had fallen on hard times. A fund the town came to call, without any ceremony or announcement from Iris herself, the Vane Trust. She never asked for credit, never sought the kind of recognition that might have been hers for the taking, and when townsfolk pressed coins or gifts on her in gratitude, she more often than not found some quiet way to redirect them towards someone whose need was greater than her own. What she wanted, and what she slowly built for herself in Copper Bend, was something she had not truly had since her father's death: a settled place, a trade respected on its own merits, and a name that was entirely, unquestionably her own. She took up work eventually as the mine's bookkeeper, then its manager of accounts, her father's old instinct for the flaw beneath the surface serving her as steadily in a ledger as it once had in a wagon wheel. And the town that had once laughed at her $4 deed came, in time, to speak her name with the particular respect reserved for those who arrive with nothing, and leave a place better than they found it. It is worth remembering, when we consider Iris Calloway's story, that she did not climb down to that wrecked wagon on Widow's Grade because she suspected treasure, or because she possessed some special foreknowledge of what waited inside it. She climbed down because she had been taught, by a father she barely had the chance to know, that value is often hidden precisely where the world has stopped looking, and because she had nothing left to lose in a town that had already decided she was worth nothing at all. The 19-year-old girl who paid $4 for salvage rights nobody else wanted was not, in the end, rewarded with gold or riches in the way old frontier legends often promise, but with something that mattered a great deal more in a place like Copper Bend: the chance to restore a dead man's good name, to lift a struggling town back onto its feet, and to prove, in the quietest and most enduring way, that the people and things others discard too quickly often deserve a second, more patient look. The wagon that hung off that cliff edge for 70 years was never truly worthless. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to climb down and see it clearly. And that, in the end, is the story of Iris Calloway. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and with Iris's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a little reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world gives them credit for. And if you haven't already, please consider following or subscribing to our channel so you never miss the next story we bring to life. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.